You're listening to The Unnamed Investigator. I'm your guide through the cases that never left me, the ones that followed me from town to town. This one was no different. Kenosha, Wisconsin, September 7th, 1977, a Wednesday. The kind of late summer day where the heat still lingers, but something in the air tells you the season is turning. On a residential street in this working-class city, on the western shore of Lake Michigan, a friend went to check on Ralph Gianoli. What they found inside that house would remain unanswered for nearly half a century. Ralph Gianoli was 48 years old. He worked at American Motors, a factory job, the kind of steady, unglamorous work that kept cities like Kenosha running. He lived alone at his home on 20th Avenue. By all accounts, he was an ordinary man living an ordinary life. And on that September morning, someone took that life from him in an extraordinarily violent way. When police arrived, the scene told a story of chaos and brutality. There was blood spatter in the bedroom and in the living room, broken beer bottles, overturned furniture, blood on the front door. This wasn't a quiet crime. This was a struggle, a fight. Someone had been in that house with Ralph Gianoli, and whatever happened between them ended with Ralph dead and the other person walking out the door and disappearing. The autopsy confirmed what the scene suggested. Ralph Gianoli died from asphyxiation by strangulation with an electrical cord noted as the instrument. He also suffered blunt force trauma to the head and abdomen. He was beaten and strangled. The violence was sustained, deliberate. And when it was over, whoever was responsible left behind a scene full of evidence, but no name to attach to it. Investigators worked the case hard in those early weeks. They collected what they could: DNA from beneath Gianoli's fingernails, blood evidence from throughout the scene, the physical evidence of the struggle itself. In 1977, DNA forensics, as we understand them today, did not exist. What investigators had were traditional methods: witness interviews, physical evidence analysis, leads that could be followed on foot and by phone. They pursued every one of them, and every one of them ran dry. No suspect was identified. No arrest was made. No one was ever charged. The case went cold. What I want you to sit with for a moment is the weight of that phrase, went cold. Because cold doesn't mean forgotten. It means the leads stopped coming. It means investigators moved to other cases because the living also demanded attention. It means Ralph Gianoli's file sat in a cabinet somewhere while the world kept moving, while the person responsible for his death kept living their life, and while 48 years passed without justice. 48 years. The same number of years Ralph Gianoli had lived when he was killed. Think about that. The case might have stayed there, buried in the archives of an unsolved past, were it not for a decision made in 2022. Kenosha police partnered with the FBI, the Wisconsin Department of Justice, and a laboratory called Othram to take another look at what had been sitting in evidence storage since 1977. Specifically, they turned their attention to the fingernail clippings collected during Ralph Gianoli's autopsy, clippings that had been preserved for nearly 5 decades. Othram applied what is known as forensic-grade genome sequencing to that material. This is not the DNA testing of 1977, or even the DNA testing of 20 years ago. This is a process that can extract and analyze genetic material at a depth and resolution that simply was not possible for most of law enforcement's history. From those clippings, Othram developed a SNP profile, a genetic blueprint of an unknown male who had been in contact with Ralph Gianoli at the time of his death. In 2023, that unknown male DNA profile was created and uploaded to genealogical databases. Investigators began the painstaking work of investigative genetic genealogy, tracing family trees, identifying relatives, narrowing the field of possible matches through the branches of a family that had no idea it was being searched. By 2025, the Wisconsin State Crime Lab had a name: James Terry Fowler. The DNA match came with a probability of 1 in 296 trillion for a random unrelated match. That is not a number that leaves room for doubt. That is a number that points to one person and one person alone. Then, investigators started pulling on the thread of who James Terry Fowler was in September of 1977. What they found was a detail that stopped the investigation cold in its tracks, not because it created doubt, but because it created devastating clarity. Military records showed that Fowler, then 19 years old, had completed naval recruit training at Great Lakes, Illinois, just 5 days before Ralph Gianoli was murdered. Great Lakes is approximately 20 miles from Kenosha. Fowler was on leave. He was nearby. He was a teenager, fresh out of basic training, in the immediate vicinity of a city where a man would soon be dead. And there was more. Background checks on Fowler revealed a 1983 conviction for killing his father in Alabama. This was not a man with no history of violence. This was a man whose record, when examined alongside the DNA evidence, painted a picture that investigators could no longer look away from. Police believe that Fowler met Ralph Gianoli on the night of the murder. The exact circumstances of how they came to be in that house together, what passed between them, what ignited the violence that followed, those details remain under investigation. The motive has not been officially confirmed. What has been confirmed is that Fowler's DNA was under Ralph Gianoli's fingernails. Ralph fought back. He left behind the evidence that would eventually name his killer. On March 30th, 2026, law enforcement went to Memphis, Tennessee, where James Terry Fowler, now 68 years old, was living his life. They arrested him at his home. He was charged with first-degree murder. His bond was set at $1.5 million. He remains in custody, awaiting extradition to Wisconsin to stand trial. No conviction has occurred yet. The legal process is still unfolding. But for the first time in 48 years, there is a name attached to what happened to Ralph Gianoli. There is an arrest. There is a charge. There is accountability moving through the system, however slowly. This marks the 7th Wisconsin cold case solved using Othram's identity inference technology. 7 cases, 7 victims whose names were at risk of becoming nothing more than unsolved file numbers. 7 families who lived for years, in some cases decades, without answers. I have spent a long time with cases like this one. Cases where the evidence existed, but the technology didn't. Cases where investigators did everything right and still came up empty because the tools available to them simply weren't sufficient for what the evidence required. What the Gianoli case tells me is something I keep coming back to every time I close a file like this one. Evidence waits. It doesn't decay the way leads do. It doesn't move away or forget what it knows. Those fingernail clippings sat in storage for 48 years, holding the answer to a question no one could yet ask in the right way. The science eventually caught up to the crime, and when it did, there was nowhere left to hide. Ralph Gianoli was a factory worker who lived alone in Kenosha, Wisconsin. He was 48 years old. He spent the last moments of his life fighting back against someone who wanted to kill him. He left behind the evidence that would one day name that person. It took nearly half a century, but the record of what happened in that house on September 7th, 1977, did not disappear. It waited. That is what this case means to me. Not just that justice can be slow. I've always known that. But that evidence, properly preserved, properly handled, and eventually properly examined, has a kind of patience that outlasts everything else. It outlasted 48 years. It outlasted the assumption that some cases simply cannot be solved. And it may yet outlast the freedom of the man whose DNA was found beneath a dead man's fingernails. The case is not closed, but it is no longer cold.